everyone, and welcome to Creating the Quest. In our panel today, we'll be speaking with some indie level designers about how they strategize and create levels for their indie games. I'm Emily. I'm a community manager over at TikTok Games, and I'll be moderating. I'm joined today by Michael Herbster from TikTok Games, James Montagna from WayForward, and Milton Guasti from Moon Studios. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Mike Herbster. I've worked in the game industry since 2006 as a level designer up to director, and I've worked on such games as Shovel Knight Treasure Trove, Boy and His Blob, Double Dragon Neon, and Contra 4.
Hi, my name is Milton. I'm a designer at Moon Studios. Before Moon, I worked on Project AM2R, that would be another Metroid 2 remake, an independent, unofficial remake of Metroid 2. And right now I'm working on Moon Studios. After working on Ori and the Will of the Wisps, we are now working on a secret unannounced project.
I'm James Montagna from WayForward, where I'm a designer and director. At the company since 2007 and worked on numerous titles, a lot of which include the games in the Shantae series, all the Shantae series games since Risky's Revenge, and I've also worked on the Mighty Switch Force series, and recently worked on a game called Vitamin Connection.
Let's start from the beginning. How do you start your level design process? Do you sketch out ideas on paper? Are there some things that you just write down? What's the methodology behind first starting that indie game level process?
So for TikTok Games, we primarily start with a pen and paper style. People can build their levels out through a documentation. They can write up what the feelings they want to get through to the player, how much energy might need to go into it, if it's the back half of the game or the front half. Just a general idea of feelings, emotions, and pain points that we want to make sure that the player maybe has to be challenged by to actually tackle. From the pen and paper / documentation phase, we jump into we first go to pitch meet to the team. The team sits down with the level designer. I'm usually the first blocker for this. I evaluate the level with them. I talk about things that I like or dislike, and then we do a polished pass on the design for the pen and paper. We then pitch it to the entire team. The team gives the thumbs up or thumbs down. If it gets the thumbs down, it goes back to polish. We then pitch it again, and then it clears, or it clears first time, which is awesome when that happens. And then the designers are left to the task of gray boxing it. So that's getting the player in there, making sure the level loads correctly, making sure it finishes, making sure that the enemies are placed in a rough pass so that you can kind of get a feel for it. And then from there, slowly but surely, we start bringing in art as that comes in. So you get your background layers, your midgrounds, some of your foreground art if the game has that or not. And from there, it just gets built upon, and over time, you continue polishing, and then you get something close to a finalized level, hopefully within the time frame of shipping.
So how do you start the design process then, Milton?
It's pretty similar. It starts with the concept art to see how a general area is going to be looking like. We got a nice list of any story beats that are going to be happening. By this time, everyone in the team is on the same page about how the story plays out and what the elements are going to be played, which characters are going to be involved in every part. And from that point on, we start directly with blockouts or gray boxing, however you call it. It's one prototype after the other of many interesting situations that are going to be using the mechanics of the area, and then we string them together into some like a conjunction of moments that are going to be taking place, and hopefully teaching some ability or challenging the player into something. It really depends on what stage of the game the players are at that particular moment, because Metroidvanias have this very wide range of player configurations that are possible in every location. So we have to consider that. And it's there is a very back and forth process between the design team and the rest of the team. Once we have a cohesive level, we usually share the prototype with other team members besides the design team, and we gather feedback as soon as possible. Even if there is no art at all, it's all rectangles and just simple polygons, we still appreciate how people feel the level, how they perceive the flow, how the moment-to-moment gameplay is played out. And even if all of the set pieces are not yet there, we get a nice idea of how it's going to be played out. And yeah, it's super refreshing to have an extra pair of eyes into something that you've been working for so long. After that, artists are going to be set dressing all of those horrible polygons and making it to something super beautiful. And then lots and lots of iteration, hopefully before deadline.
Similar process over at WayForward?
Yeah, I think Mike and Milton both gave really good answers on that. So I'll kind of talk about first getting started on the level design process for an entirely new game. Let's say you've made no levels. There's a key point to consider when you're first starting, and that is the rules. And then the other point to consider when you're doing individual levels would be, I suppose I would call it the context. So the first is to learn the game itself and its rules. So about the rules, you have to know your navigation. So for a platformer, it might be things like the number of world units high a character can jump, the number of units across so you can make sure they pass any pits you make. And it's pretty important to lock that stuff down as early as possible, because if it changes, say we want to make the main character move a little bit slower, it might invalidate the levels you built around it. So it's really important to kind of like figure that stuff out early if possible. That's not to say that it always works out that way. Sometimes you have to revise, but revision's the name of the game when you're developing. It's also important to, I guess, think about like the enemies that will be debuted in your level, and knowing how the different enemies operate is very important. The rules expand beyond just like the player mobility in enemies. So the thing is, you gotta know how each enemy is going to interact with the player from an individual basis when you're in the game. And one way forward process for that is to establish like a debug or testing room that's not intended for the player to access it. It's just for our development purposes, and we usually call that a gym. So you can have, there's different types of gyms. You can have a platform gym, which has every different type of platform. It has every different type of collision. Soft collision, which means you can jump through it or drop down through it. Hard collision, which you can't pass through. Every different angle of slope to test out to see how you interact with it. Then there's like we call it a zoo gym, which is essentially individual rooms with each different enemy in the game, so you can interact with them and test them out, get to learn their combat mechanics. There's countless more types of gyms. So some are for testing specific abilities even, but setting this up can help you learn the rules of the game. So when you start your level design process, you have a good feel for what you're working with. Then once you've kind of locked in the rules, that's where the context part comes in. You want to establish a roadmap. And this is sometimes done in coordination with like a director, but you probably want to know what enemies or treasures will be debuted in each level, so it provides a bit of context about the level you're making. And like, where in the game is the level? Can it be reached early on, where players are still getting a feel for everything, learning controls, or perhaps it's a point where the players unlocked all their abilities and you have every tool at your disposal. In a non-linear exploration game, which is sometimes informally called like a Metroidvania, right? Knowing what tools or abilities that the players have access to at any point in time is critical, so you can design around those. And knowing which abilities are acquired on the critical path, that is, you must have encountered this ability in order to continue, makes it so you can start to seriously design a level. And that's the important things to establish when you're first starting the process, I believe.
That's great. A lot of you guys went over briefly some of the other questions that we have written down for today. So we'll be diving a little bit more into those specific topics. You discussed, James, a little bit about navigating through a level. What kind of tips or tricks do you have to what makes navigating a level fun?
Sure. Well, I kind of think of the level designer as a conductor orchestrating the experience for the player, right? So it can be like a battle of wits between the designer and the player sometimes. We're kind of always at like this advantage because you have the ability to completely wipe the player out at any second. If you want to like make like a crushing ceiling slam down at 0.5 seconds with no time to react, obviously you could do that and someone would call it cheat and say the game isn't fun. So yes, it's this battle of wits, but we have to be mindful of that and coast them in and like orchestrate the experience so they feel empowered where we want them to feel empowered, or overwhelmed where we want them to feel that, etc. So I think being mindful of that is a key point to the fun factor of navigation. It might be as simple as giving the player a platform to rest on, like okay, so using Shantae's lab as an example, right? There's that's an example of like a non-linear room-based level design style, and it throws room after room of like these like varied challenges at you. But when you're playing through, you might notice there's like some rooms that don't have any threat in them, right? So when you design your levels with fun in mind, I'd say don't feel like you have to fill every empty area with something, because it's intentional that we have those rooms without a threat. It gives the player an opportunity to rest and get their bearings, and I think that's just as important to the fun factor as the challenges we throw at them. So, and to use another example, think about like, let's see, think about playing like Mega Man. That's a good one. So when you're playing Mega Man, which is a linear room-based level design style, this applies there too. Like, how many times have you been in like that empty hallway like before you fight a boss, and it's just like this empty stretch, and you just run past it and you have this moment like, all right, let's go. Or maybe you stop and you assess it and you like look at your abilities and see, okay, I have this much ability left. It's important to let the player breathe and be in their head for a moment to actually stop and acknowledge the fun they're having as they navigate through the level.
Much like James just said about doing an orchestra, I actually 100% agree in that aspect. It's like setting the right tempo. It's like figuring out, like, does your song start off with a lot of hard hits? Does it give the player enough time to breathe in between? I know at WayForward, when I had my tenure there, I briefly had talked with James several times about basically breathing room. It's like, yeah, you did something hard, but like, here's the waiting spot, or here's the checkpoint. Like that's when the player, the energy level drops a little. They realize they get to at least come back to a point. Or like setting your checkpoint in the Ori games, which I really appreciate that you guys have that functionality as well. It's important to make sure the player is challenged, but also that it's a fair challenge, or it's something that they can they can possibly get through by hook or crook. I have a firm belief that the player should always feel challenged, but if something's going to, I don't want to say break, but like if it's like, oh, the game's funner because I've broken the rules a little bit for the player, that's a bank error in the favor of the player. And I will always want to push for the player to feel better about succeeding, even if I've fudged the rules just a little to make it so that it's better for them. But also you want to make sure that it's, much like with B.ARK, B.ARK is a side-scrolling shooter. That's previously a lot of my work's been platformers, so this is a whole new genre of like auto-scroll shooter that I've had to evaluate and think differently of. Not to call out James for Cat Girl Without Salad, but I know you were a part of that, so you've probably felt similarly about waves of enemies flying in. It's like, how much is too much? How much can you throw at the player? Well, okay, I've used those guys way too much now. Let's toss in a little bit of pepper for this scene. Let's throw in the brass in this one to do a cooking and a symphony motif there for everybody. But to pull it all together into one piece definitely is what the level designer is trying to do. It's trying to make sure that all the loose ends are pulled in correctly, everything feels good, and that the player is not only challenged but feels rewarded from doing it. It's not a, oh my god, I got through it and now I don't want to play anymore. It's an, oh my god, what's next?
Now I know that Ori has some really smooth navigation in their levels. Everything always just feels like a symphony. Do you have any like kind of hints or tricks that you use for making navigation fun through that?
Well, it really helps that the player character, the controller for Ori, is super smooth and it's just fun to jump around. Just a wall jump. It feels bouncy and fun and floaty, and that's already a huge advantage. We only need to make nice, lovely playgrounds for players to express themselves, and in doing so, we also did expand a lot on the combat mechanics for Ori and the Will of the Wisps. So there is a certain synergy between the platforming and combat. There is a lot of movement and positioning involved in the Ori's combat right now. The combination of melee and range attacks is something that allows the players to just combine that whatever they want, and finding the right combinations of enemy behaviors to throw at the player at several points is interesting. But usually, the challenge regarding combat is pretty much safe for very specific set pieces where the player is trapped in a room and they need to defeat a couple of enemies. And those are very carefully crafted combinations of enemies to actually make a fun encounter. And there's also the optional shrine challenges that you pretty much need to fight several waves of enemies to get an upgrade. But that's optional, and that's something that the players are going to be engaging by themselves if they want to be, trying their new loadout on a set of enemies. Then again, like it was already described, emotion, silence, going through the paces of what the player is going to be experiencing is something that we take into consideration in every section of the game that we want to design. There is a moment that we are going to be having an introduction to some new enemy, then we are going to find a small story moment, then we're going to be seeing some set piece that we cannot interact with yet because that's going to be requiring some ability that we are going to be getting later on. Then we get the ability, we have a small safe section of the level that's just designed to have fun with the new ability that you learn. And then when you re-explore and rediscover the same level with your new ability, then suddenly it opens up into more possibilities, both for the combat, traversal, exploration. And usually in Ori, it either ends with a boss that's going to be taking pretty much your skills to the test, or an escape sequence that's pretty much execution. If you react enough with the new abilities that you got, then you're going to be doing just fine.
That's a great point about the abilities and how they kind of factor into having fun navigating, and you can also use that as a teaching device. I know in Shantae, whenever we teach a new ability, really similar to how we unfold that in Ori, we have this moment where the player can just have fun using this new ability that they have. And in fact, the way we use it as a teaching device is typically in Pirate's Curse and Seven Sirens, the latest entry, we have it so that when you get a new ability, we put the player in a room that they can just freely use it without any risk of taking damage or anything like that. But we take it a step further and we make it so the player is forced to learn to use it properly because they can't exit the room until they have used the ability successfully. So that way you make sure that they've learned it, and not only are they having fun just navigating around with this ability, but we can use it as a teaching moment too.
And it's a lot more organic doing this than just pestering the player with text on the screen that says, press X to execute your new whatever.
And sometimes it's a mix of both you need, right?
Yeah, sometimes.
That actually feeds really, really well into the next question, which is when you're navigating a level and people are having a hard time kind of figuring out where they need to go, what kind of tips and tricks do you use, Milton, whenever you're doing Ori or other games, to kind of give them a little bit of a hint or a push in the right direction, or do you give them a huge push? How do you do what's the nuance of that?
Okay, so on the macro level, talking about entire places, we use a lot of very memorable, huge landmarks to just make the point that this particular place is important, right? And sometimes it's a huge entrance or a huge statue that's very distinct, that stands out from the environment. Sometimes it's a huge character NPC. We have a sleeping bear that's pretty much a gate. And by just getting that into the player's memory, seeing maybe I should go back and explore that later on, we do give the players a couple of very important points in the map that we're going to be considering later. Later on, you get some ability that lets you open that particular landmark and continue exploring on. And there is also that smaller scale version of that, whenever you have some sort of gate mechanic or something that we already mentioned, that changes its context after you get a new ability or a new item. So that would be a smaller version of that. and how you approach the level and how you understand the place and how it works, it certainly helps gauging what can be done in each location. And for the moment-to-moment gameplay, small details like panning the camera towards a place that should be on the player's attention, or maybe playing a little bit with a splash of color or some distinctness in the art. We usually leave some comments on the blockouts or gray boxes, like this pedestal will be important. Please make it stand out. And then the artist, whenever it's going to be making its addressing, is going to be doing something according to that intention, and that's going to be back and forth accordingly. But then again, those are small nuances that do help and are not very intrusive, and they pretty much are in theme with the level.
I know that recently we were discussing this for a thing in B.ARK, Herbster, about there was like a gate that people had to go through, and specifically how we pointed in them in the direction of how to open that gate.
Yeah, it was so there's two trains of thoughts that I have for making sure to draw player attention. One of them is definitely making sure like the art surrounding the area is definitely eye-catchy. The other aspect is possibly putting like a sheen on breakable objects or other things like that, so they almost visually stand out from the world itself, even though they are a part of the world. One thing that I know Valve does that I'm really impressed by when looking back at like their older stuff, like Half-Life 2 and other things like that, in a 3D space, you can obviously control like lighting a lot more than even Ori actually does a good job of lighting for this as well. It's like if there's an open new path, it's like gleams of god lights like shine through it, and you can tell that you're supposed to interact with them next. Or in Valve's case, it's like there's only one singular lamppost over the door frame that's slightly ajar that you need to go inspect. It's like it's basically always drawing the player's attention in the right direction to make sure that they're focused and being led, but obviously not feeling like they are being led in that direction. It's like the game's environments effectively lead them to the jelly bean trail or breadcrumbs that lead to the exit point. The other key takeaway that I've learned, even from B.ARK specifically, is that since we're in an auto-scroller all the time, since it's a shooter, it's like making sure the player isn't interested in areas that could get them killed. It's like, yeah, we want to have a whole set of guppy enemies fly out from this hole, but if the hole's too wide, then the player's going to go, that's a secret, I'm going up in there. And it's like, yeah, we can't do that. Try to pull it in a little bit, maybe fudge the sides here, make sure the art kind of covers it up. Here's some load-bearing art just right there. And it's like, hopefully that's enough to keep the player out. You're still always going to get somebody that's, not to throw James under the bus, but the player expect everything and break it all, which is a great portion of why I love working with James, is because James can find all the holes that
I will find every single thing you didn't intend me to see and break it. Which, you know, that's an important part of level design too. It's not only about like designing the navigation of where you want to push the player. It's making sure like to not draw their eye where you don't want them to go. Right. So yeah, there's a few different ways to do that as well. So I think this is maybe ingrained in us as players from a lot of old school games. Will do stuff where you'll get rewarded for going through a wall that looked like a solid wall, and you'll find something where, like, I think of the original Super Mario Brothers, where you're just running along the top of like the second 1-2 stage, and you get to the warp zone, which is fun too. I think a lot of games these days try to maybe players over the head with it a little bit more, but back then it was a little bit more hidden. So I think old school gamers in their DNAs like explore, push against every wall to see if you can go through it. Mm-hmm. I mean that's a way of doing things. As far as navigation goes, if all else fails, you can do what Super Mario World does and just always put like an arrow sign in the background. I mean, hey, it worked for them. If it's good enough for Mario, I think it's okay.
Just to make a coin trail, whatever the context is.
Lead the player with coins.
So now that we've talked a little bit about navigation, let's talk a little bit about narrative. How much do you incorporate narrative into the game, the level design process? I know right now, Herbster, we're working on B.ARK, and B.ARK has a lot of narrative. How you level out the narrative versus the gameplay versus the enemies? As we've been discussing, there's a lot of stuff going on in there. Like, how do you put that into the process?
So for the early stages of gray boxing, even before that, when we're doing the pen and paper, initially, since we knew a lot of the backstory and how the enemies were going to tie into our main characters for B.ARK, we specifically tried to make sure to call out in our level design draw-ups, our blueprinting almost, where key story points were going to trigger. We didn't necessarily know what was going to be said or kind of what was going to happen, but the general feel of like, okay, we're going to have a conversation with the main baddie and the 4 pilots for this section. And we're going to mark each time that a conversation might occur or what type of emotion or event we want to get out of the characters talking. And our game kind of works a little like Star Foxy. The characters have little pop-up HUDs down at the bottom that like they say their lines and then it moves on. And we do our best to make sure that player control isn't taken away unless it's a major event. And in order to make sure that it all feels fluid. Most of the time, we're trying our best to tie the gameplay into the story as much as we can. It's like, oh, here comes the ice droids after this enemy just attacked them, and now they're shattering, like raining down on the players. It's like we write that section into the blueprinting. We hand that off to the creative director that might be writing up our story, or if we have somebody that's doing script, then they're aware of that situation to hopefully write something condensed, because obviously you don't want it too bloated or else the scene will last too long. If the scene lasts too long, the ice droids get drawn out, the player gets bored, etc., etc. But yeah, it's mostly just trying to make sure everybody's holding hands and we're all still like focused on the vision of getting to the end point. I mean, how about the narrative flow with Ori?
Yeah.
I know that you guys have some great narrative stuff going on.
There's the thing is, the important story beats, all the major parts of the story regarding cutscenes, all the flashbacks, all the really, really important stuff, that's managed by the story team, and there's a dedicated group of modelers and animators that do magic. Usually by the time we have blockouts at hand to actually place the triggers for those, we already have storyboards at least, or at least the rough versions of what the timing of the cutscenes are going to be. So we know the contents, we know what characters are going to be involved in whatever is going to be happening in each place. And yeah, that's very straightforward. It's pretty much the same process. One thing I really, really like personally, taking into consideration whenever I design a level or an environment, is the world building that could be happening. I really like to be in touch with the concept artists regarding what the place is going to be looking like, if there was any civilization living there, if there is any mechanisms, the level of technology that these people have, how complex can be moving parts going on, if it's going to be all natural, what kind of gimmick there's going to be in the level, if there were any inhabitants or any current NPCs living in the place or were living there. And based on that, I like to add tiny details, taking that into consideration. And the most important, the most interesting part of designing Ori regarding world building was the were spinning blades. That would be like a hub that's slowly getting populated with NPCs as soon as you encounter them in the wild. And every little NPC that you have in that place have their own tiny story, their small side quest, or just a little bit of dialogue. But behind that, there are props near the characters, so we can actually give them a little bit of depth, even if it's not explicit. And thinking of those tiny stories, even if it's not going to be contributing directly to the story, is at least I do find it super fun. And it makes the whole world feel a lot more alive and living.
I know there's a lot of really great characters hidden in the levels for Shantae. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, James?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of quest giving in Shantae games where you encounter characters and they're looking for a particular item, and that of course is level design that's driven by the narrative, and it gives us the opportunity to introduce a lot of different personalities into the game. But it doesn't stop just there. I think occasionally the narrative can serve the specific purpose of introducing a level design concept. Now, if you have a small project, an indie team, and the same person doing the level design is the same person that's writing the story, you can set yourself up for stuff like this. On a bigger team, I think it takes some coordination from the director, or if there is a story team, coordinating as level design department with that story team to do stuff like that. I'll give you an example. I think, Shantae, Half Genie Hero, have a magic carpet race plotline, which allowed us to do a whole level based on the challenge of jumping from one moving magic carpet platform to the other. And that was all just because we inserted that as like a plot device specifically so we could do this cool level. So with Shantae games, you've got the characters, but there's also specific events that the story tees up for the level designer. Another one is like you're being chased by a giant sandworm, also in Half Genie Hero. That's Wilbur for those that are familiar, and that ties directly into the story. Again, it informs the level design. So the story might allow you to do crazy one-off challenges.
Something else that we discussed earlier a little bit, that we can go a little bit more into detail, is what sort of ways do you incorporate color into your level designs? I know in Ori, it's a game that's really, really rich in color and color palette. Like, what would you say your thought process is into adding those color palettes or changing them if you're trying to like push somebody in a specific direction?
Well, besides notes on a blockout, most of the color work is done by the artists. Okay. Usually, we export a huge map of the entire area in its raw blockout form, just to geometry. And artists are going to be gathering later on to actually make a paint over of a color exploration of how the theme of the concept art is going to be applied in every location of that level, and how it's going to be connecting to nearby areas. So if you're going from a forest into the desert, how many scenes are going to be in the middle to actually make that transition feel natural and smooth and not all that sudden. That's it starts with designing and assigning what base colors are going to be displayed both in the foreground and background, and then that's going to be also influencing how the levels are set dressed following that cue.
I know that Vitamin Connection is a really colorful game as well. It kind of reminds you of like the colors in like a cartoon of sorts. What would you say was like the colors were used in level design for that game?
So it is a very colorful game, and so I think with that one we definitely wanted to make sure that the colors were used to create sort of a contrast. So a lot of our backgrounds in that game are darker, so that the enemies and the character, which is a colorful like capsule ship, will really pop on screen. And we have these like really bright walls. So by playing with the color and the level design, deciding what color we wanted the walls to be, we could help draw the player's eye to what are the walls. In that game, you don't want to collide with the walls. You're trying to navigate through them, right? So we use these vibrant colors so they pop against the dark background. So this is the area you can navigate through freely, and then this is the area that is you want to try to not collide with. And then all the enemies and stuff will pop out on the darker background. And different colors will create a different mood. So we tried thinking about like what sort of colors we want to use in different levels in that game. So we have a level where you're inside of a dog's intestines, and the colors of the walls are like a really bright orange, yellow color, and the pace of that stage is very fast. It creates this very alert feeling. Then when we have like a calm, kind of slower moving stage, we'll use like kind of a blue tones. So these different tones tell a different story. And it can not only set a tone, but you can get a lot of mileage in terms of using the same art. Now, this is for Shantae. I don't know if this is like a secret. I'm going to blow someone's mind here. But the different labyrinths in Shantae actually use the same artwork for the floor and the wall bricks in every different labyrinth. No, right? It's the same art, but we color it differently. So you can pair that with a different background, and suddenly it feels like completely fresh and different. And something I also like to do with Shantae is play with the lighting. So I'll tint rooms different colors. And in our latest Shantae and the Seven Sirens, the first labyrinth of the game is the Water Lily's Den, which I was responsible for designing much of. And the first time you encounter a captive genie, Plink, is in a room where she gives you this special power to transform into the Dash Nude. So in order to really accent this room as being special, ethereal, I kind of brightened up the colors overall, and I put a subtle blue tint or glow over everything, and just ribbons of blue colors streaming through the background. And even if it's just subconsciously, the player feels this energy flowing through the room, and it's not like other rooms. A different mood has been set entirely. The player senses it.
I know that all the characters in B.ARK currently, they all have specific colors that kind of represent them. How do you come up with a level and have them all fit into that level?
Primarily, a lot of focus went into applying the characters on the background, seeing if they pop correctly. Very similar to the way that James described Vitamin Connection. I almost tripped on that one. That would have been a bad one. But the aspect of just making sure the characters pop, just to call out some fun stuff that might have been seen recently, was we have a stage Jupiter that has a really very yellowish hue for the background, but there's these jellyfish in the stage, and they really pop because they're a vibrant purple, but then they shoot off little electrical bolts that are also yellow, but you can actually see them because they're a darker shade than the background itself. And it's just a very vibrant scene of oh, well, what's that? The levels haven't our shooter is primarily focused on the easier side. You can touch the walls without too much of a worry, which is not the way classic shooters work, but for this one, we're trying to make sure that it's kid-friendly along with challenging for adults. But that level in particular is actually on this level, don't touch the walls. And that's the big rift of that stage is the focus is the back half. Now you're playing a game of don't touch anything, but still focus on shooting your bad guys in the process. So it's more about making sure everything's visually stunning, making sure if your character has a super, that's got a good VFX attached to it. I know over at WayForward you guys have Joel. That guy's amazing for really knocking up things to an extra notch in order to catch eyes. We've got a great VFX team at TikTok as well, and all of our supers and everything just really pop on screen when they're triggered and everything that involve just keeping the player focused on their actions and what they can do.
So now that we've kind of gone over some of the broader concepts of creating a level, how do you measure the success of that level that you've been creating? I know a lot of times people will use playtesters, and if you do use playtesters, what kind of questions do you ask them? What's the process behind measuring that success, Milton?
Usually we observe them in their natural habitat from a distance, trying to not interfere with their experience, because the more you interfere, the more you adulterate the results. It's
you almost taint the water, right? You don't want to.
I can just imagine Steve Irwin talking about it back.
Yeah, and the moment they do something that you don't want them to do, you goes, oh, don't go there, please. That's not how it's supposed to work. Yeah. That kind of thing is eye-opening sometimes. You get this point of view that are fresh compared to seeing the level all the time and having these issues that you don't see because they are so close. Yes, iteration after iteration and tester after tester until they pretty much go through the motions however you want. Another very important tool that comes a little bit later on is telemetry. Telemetry is super, super important. Once more testing is conducted, usually by the entire team, you start to see the patterns and the places where there are spikes in difficulty. If you are able to actually visualize an overlay over the map where people are actually dying the most, that was pretty eye-opening into some places that we thought were normal or a little bit easy, but suddenly in the hands of other players that were not the design team, those were actually challenging. And the most use for that was to balance the escape sequences. escape sequences went through many iterations, and I was the main designer on that on those. And yeah, for me they were super easy, and suddenly it wasn't the case.
I'm
So,
still
yeah,
struggling with a few of them. So
many
Yeah, that's the
iterations,
hardest
and,
part. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. The sooner you get the opinion of other people, the better, and the more the cheaper the changes are going to be on the long run.
Yeah, I think getting other people to play your game is a must. And like, this is so cheesy, dude. You have to forgive me, but it's legitimate, and I swear by it. I have something called the smile test, and it's mostly what it sounds like. When a player's playing the game for the first time. Okay, so as a director, I can be loud, but there's one moment where I kind of just like shut up and watch. And it's like Milton was saying, you have to just kind of observe, and it's always like, oh, don't go there, don't do that. But when someone new is playing my game, you can gather so much information. So just from watching new people play, so I like to watch and see if the person that's playing smiles or like emotes at all. And not everybody's a smiler. Some people, they'll just give like a little nod, like, "Oh, I got it." And that counts, okay? But if your level design is getting some kind of like positive emotive response from the player, I consider that a successful design. Because at the end of the day, the core reason games exist is to produce that positive reaction or fun.
So B.ARK's a weird case because the intention is to have it be a couch co-op experience. We really can't do that right now. Testing has also been a fun hurdle. It's been we've definitely learned a lot and have tried to come up with some debug features to allow us to do a single player multiplayer experience, which sounds like we're putting ourselves in knots, but we got to do something. The one thing that I will admit, because everybody's brought it up here as well, is that just getting it in the hands of players or people that you trust that are differing values of like, I don't want to be that guy that says like hardcore gamer or like noob. It's like you're looking for. I have a wonderful friend that I've known for years named Chris Anderson, and that guy is not to say that he's bad at games, but he enjoys being a novice. He loves that he's not good, and I appreciate seeing how he plays games because he'll play them differently than like my buddy James here will, or I imagine even Milton would, or even Emily would. Or even as I would, because I play Smash Brothers to a level that Chris like looks at as like a mountaintop he'll never climb. And I see Chris play it, and I can tell he's still having fun just hitting the B button and only the B button and getting a reaction out of people. So there's the moment of smiles, there's the moment of struggling and seeing people get through it. Feedback is important, but also feedback has to be taken into consideration. It's much like keeping your mouth shut and watching what they're doing. You have to remember that the next step that you go into when you start asking questions of your playtesters, what the question is you're asking, because if the question leads them in the wrong direction, you're going to get bad information. But you could also ask the wrong question and not actually ask something about, like you could ask something like, how do you feel about that? And that could lead in thousands of directions. Or you could lead them towards a direction that actually gives you information that can give you a better game. It was like, was that section hard? It's like you could say the whole level's hard, or if you specified an area where you saw them die, then you actually get concentrated feedback that can be reacted to without being too knee-jerky. Because if it's the level's hard, you could go in and rewrite a whole new, like redo the whole level again from scratch, and that doesn't help necessarily the production at all.
James, you've worked on Shantae, which I know has a lot of replay ability. It's like I've replayed the games in the Shantae series over and over again. How do you incorporate replayability into your level designs?
There's numerous ways to do that, and sometimes it's just making experience so fun that players want to do it again and again. But I think there's a lot of techniques to it. So one of them would be like hiding treats all over. Like in Vitamin Connection, we have like these ion stars, which there's 5 per stage, and in order to unlock a bonus stage, you have to collect all of them. So it kind of encourages players to go back into the stage and explore every nook and cranny to get them all. And same as for the heart squids and the labyrinths of Shantae. But there's also like putting something in an earlier stage that seeds a future event. So like you could get an ability and then come back later and replay the level to open a path with your new ability. and that's one way to incorporate replayability. Kirby games are really good about that. You get an ability and you come back to a place, and you can use that. So if you have the particular ability at the right place, you can access a secret area. I also directed a Mighty Switch Force game, which was a Mighty Switch Force Hose It Down, which you can get on iOS, Android, Steam, PC. But in that game, the puzzle designs were specifically crafted so that players would want to go back and try again to get a better clear time. So another way you can incorporate replayability is encouraging players to do better in the stage, whether it's the time, the number of things they collected, just encouraging them to go back and accomplish something greater is one way to incorporate replayability.
Specifically from like a B.ARK direction, B.ARK's got like since we're in the vein of like classic shooters or shoot 'em ups, primarily we have a high score system. So part of the play session, it's like once you finish a stage, you get your tally screen and it spits out a high score, and then that's tracked. So the player can see how much they might have improved or how many enemies they might have downed. Very similar to like Star Fox, which actually Star Fox 64 marked how many guys you killed, and you could get medals for that. Another example of like replayability that I'm fond of, since James brought up Kirby, is like a Super Mario World. The exclamation mark blocks. It's like some of those sections are like, oh, I can see there's an outline there. I wonder what I'm going to get when I come back. And it leads to a whole other area, or it leads you to a key and a keyhole section. It's like there's many ways to draw out the gameplay experience and to make a player want to go back. I know with Milton and Ori, it's like you guys show, it's very much in the Metroid-esque. It's like, oh, I see that I could get there. Like, I could reach that, but there's something blocking me. Therefore, I have to come back to re-experience this area again. And it could be very early on in the first opening sections. And that is locked in here to come back to revisit it once I have more abilities.
Yeah, I mean, that moment when you get the final movement ability and blazing through the levels is super, super comfortable and nice and fun. And filling all the blank spaces in the map is always super fun. Besides that, there's also this the thing about the systems, the shard systems, pretty much trying out different combinations of shards that affect how you move and how you do combat. It's also a nice way to experiment, and people discussing about what the best combinations are for them, their favorite weapons or their favorite spells. That adds a little bit of variety when you want to try out something different. But something I did realize that, yes, the competitive edge is something that's really important for certain kinds of people. I do remember when we were in E3 2018, we were, after the initial ceremony with the huge Xbox presentation, we were helping out the press, being showcased the game. And in between shifts, we were there just waiting around, and why don't we race the demo? Who is fastest? I designed the level, I should be the winner. No, I'm very skillful, whatever. And suddenly we have a row of 6 different people, all part of the design team, artists, whatever, and we were racing, we were speedrunning in real time. And that was fun. It was amazing. I cannot second, but yeah. The thing is, based on that, they did emphasize a lot on the Spirit Trials game mode. And suddenly, from that, that was showcased in Gamescom later.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is a little bit of this competitive edge, and having that happen with such a well-flowing game like Ori, it's always super fun.
Well, awesome. That looks like it's time, guys. We don't have any time for any more questions, unfortunately. But would you guys like to promote a little bit about your projects, where we can find you on social media in the future?
Sure thing. Yeah. Definitely check out Vitamin Connection. It's a Nintendo Switch exclusive game that has a co-op gameplay focus, but you can also play it solo. And it puts you in the role of characters Vitaboy and Minigirl, and you pilot a vitamin capsule ship, and you go inside of people's bodies or inside of objects, like there's a TV stage. One stage you're even in a family dog, and try to heal them from the inside by fighting a bacteria menace. And there's a variety of sub-games in that as well, which are a lot of fun. And also check out our latest Shantae release, which is Shantae and the Seven Sirens. And that's on all major consoles, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, PC. Definitely worth checking out. And follow WayForward on Twitter at WayForward. If you want to follow me personally on Twitter, I've made a public promise to eat a piece of candy for each person that follows me. So if you'd like to feed me candy, you can follow me at James Popstar. And feel free to hit me up and ask me any questions you have about WayForward games.
If you haven't played Ori and the Will of the Wisps yet, feel free to get it. It's on Xbox and PC. It's also included on Game Pass. It's a beautiful game, objectively speaking, of course. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. Right now, if you want to follow me personally, you can find me on Twitter at Dr. M64. And yeah, if you want to reach out or whatever, I'll be here.
B.ARK is a 4-player co-op shoot-'em-up. It's in the vein of Parodius, classic shoot-'em-up. That's what we're aiming for with the game. And our focus has been making sure that the game can be played from all ages while still being challenging for people that love the genre while still making it easily accessible for children. We have some cool features like sidecar mode. If a buddy dies, you can pick them up and help them to get to the end of the stage. Or our other fun aspect is we have super fusions. So your character already has a super, and then you go into another player's super. You briefly make contact with each other, and it'll enhance the super to a new level. Beyond that, we've got some cool tally screens and some great 4-player action coming your way soon on the Nintendo Switch. If you're interested in more information about B.ARK, please take a look at following us on Twitter at TikTok Games. And if you're interested in reaching out to me with any questions that you may still have, please feel free to hit me up through Twitter at Michael Herbstar. The last E in my normal name of Herbster is replaced with an A. And hopefully, maybe in the future, these 4 of us could get together to play some B.ARK when it's out.
Thank you for joining us today, everyone, and thank you so much to James, Michael, and Milton for coming on the panel to discuss indie level design with us. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your PAX Online experience.